I woke up to the sound of my own name being practiced. Not spoken, practiced, soft, careful, like they were trying it on for size, seeing how it would land once I was gone. Mom would have wanted it that way, my daughter said from the hallway. Her voice had that polished sympathy people use when they're already planning the next step. Grandma hated paperwork. My grandson added, a little too quick, like he'd memorized his line. I was supposed to be asleep, or sedated, or already slipping. That's what the chart on the door suggested. But my mind was sharp, my ears sharper. Years of raising children alone will do that. You learn to listen between sentences. The hospital room smelled like bleach and wilted flowers. Someone had brought lilies. I hate lilies. They know that. Or they did once. My chest hurt when I breathed, but not enough to stop me from listening. They said it's just a matter of time. My son murmured. He sounded almost relieved. Then we should be ready, my daughter replied. No surprises. That word, surprises, settled into me like a stone. I shifted slightly, just enough to make the blanket rustle. Silence snapped into place. Footsteps retreated. The door clicked shut. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the cracks like I used to count pennies when money was tight. Old habit. Survival habit. I wasn't dying. Not today. The doctor had been clear, even if my children chose not to hear it. Complications, yes. Monitoring, yes. But recovery was expected. Likely. Probable. That wasn't what they'd heard. What they'd heard was time. By afternoon, the performances began. They came in pairs, then singles. Hands clasped too tightly. Voices lowered. Questions that weren't really questions. Do you remember where you put the house papers? Did you ever finish updating the will? Mom, if anything happens, do you want to be cremated? I watched them carefully, the way you watch people who think you're already finished. Their eyes drifted, not to my face, but to the corners of the room. The chair, the bag, the drawer, inventory. When the nurse came in to check my vitals, my daughter stepped aside, like she owned the place. Like I was already an item being managed. I felt something shift in my chest then. Not fear, not sadness, clarity. Because I was hospitalized, they waited for me to die so they could inherit. I waited for them to lie. The title formed in my mind before I ever said a word. It fit too well, too clean. That's how I knew this wasn't paranoia. It was recognition. I smiled at them that evening, weak, grateful, exactly what they needed to see. I'm tired, I whispered. We'll talk later. They exchanged glances. A silent agreement passed between them, smooth as silk. Later never comes when you're counting on someone not to last the night. After they left, I asked the nurse for a pen. Then another. Then my glasses. I didn't write anything yet. I just needed to feel the weight of the pen in my hand. Proof that I still could. Outside the window, the sun was setting slow and red, like it had nowhere else to be. I thought about the house I paid off with overtime and patience. The accounts I built dollar by dollar. The documents tucked away where only I knew to look. They thought this was a waiting game. They were right, but they didn't understand who was doing the waiting. If you've ever felt that quiet shift, the moment you realize love has been replaced by calculation, stay with me. This story doesn't rush. Neither do I. By morning, I would hear something I wasn't meant to hear. And that would change everything. My name is Jocelyn Graham, and this is my story. Morning came with a knock that didn't wait for an answer. My daughter entered first, already mid-sentence, like the conversation had started somewhere else, and I was late to it. She was holding a coffee she doesn't drink, wearing a cardigan she saves for church and funerals. Behind her, my son lingered near the door, scrolling his phone, pretending not to listen while catching every word. "How are we feeling today?" she asked. "We." I told her the truth. "Awake." She smiled too wide, then reached for the chair beside my bed and pulled it closer. That movement, small, deliberate, felt practiced, like she'd done it in her head already. "We were talking last night," she said, lowering her voice, "about making things easier for you." My son finally looked up. "There's no need for stress," he added. "Especially now." Especially now. As if this was a window closing. I nodded slowly, playing my part, letting them believe the script was still theirs. "What kind of easier?" I asked. They glanced at each other again. Quick, efficient, years of shared glances. I used to think that meant closeness. Now I saw it for what it was: coordination. "Well," my daughter began, "just little things. Knowing where everything is. Accounts. Insurance. The house." "The house," my son echoed like a cue. I studied them the way I used to study contracts before signing. The pauses were timed. The concern evenly distributed. Even their sighs sounded rehearsed, like they'd practiced sounding burdened without sounding greedy. "I'm not going anywhere today," I said calmly. "Oh, of course not," my daughter replied too fast. "We're just being responsible." Responsible. That word again. Funny how it only shows up when someone else's name is on the deed. The nurse came in then, cheerful and efficient. She checked my blood pressure, asked about pain, adjusted the 4. My daughter stepped back, but didn't leave. She watched the nurse's hands like she was memorizing a routine. "Your vitals look stable," the nurse said. "Doctor will round later this morning." Stable. That word landed heavy. After the nurse left, the room felt smaller. My son cleared his throat. "There's also the matter of power of attorney," he said. "Just in case. Just in case." The phrase slid across the room like a chess piece. I felt the old ache rise. The one that comes from realizing the people you protected are now measuring you. But I didn't let it show. Emotion is information. I learned that a long time ago. "I already have won," I said. Their faces stilled. Not shocked, not relieved, just recalculating. "With who?" my daughter asked carefully. "With someone I trust," I replied. That was the first unscripted moment. I could tell because my son shifted his weight and my daughter smoothed her cardigan again, resetting. "Well," she said after a beat, "we just want to make sure there are no complications." Complications. As if I were a process, not a person. They stayed another 20 minutes, circling the same questions from different angles. Each time I answered just enough. Each time they adjusted, like actors running lines, trying different deliveries to see which one landed. When they finally left, the silence felt earned. I stared at the door long after it closed. Something had crystallized overnight. It wasn't just that they were waiting for me to die. It was that they'd already organized themselves around that outcome. I reached for my call button. When the nurse returned, I asked her a simple question. "Has anyone requested access to my medical information?" She hesitated. Just a flicker. But I saw it. "Yes," she said carefully. "Your daughter called earlier." Earlier. Before morning rounds. Before certainty. I thanked her and lay back against the pillows, my mind already moving, pieces sliding into place, patterns forming. This wasn't panic. This was planning. And somewhere outside that door, they were already a few steps ahead, thinking I was still catching up. By noon, I knew exactly what my first mistake had been. I had underestimated how quickly entitlement turns into urgency. The doctor came in with a tablet tucked under his arm, his tone professional, but warm. He explained my test results again. Stable, improving, no immediate danger. He used phrases like monitoring and conservative treatment, words that leave room for time. My daughter stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, nodding too much. My son leaned against the wall, jaw tight. When the doctor finished, my daughter asked, "So, realistically, how long are we looking at?" The room went still. The doctor paused. "That's not a straightforward question. I just mean," she said smoothly, "for planning purposes." Planning. There it was again. The doctor glanced at me. Not them. Me. As he should. "Your mother is expected to recover," he said. "Discharge depends on how she responds over the next few days." Days. My son exhaled sharply, like he'd been holding his breath for a different answer. After the doctor left, they didn't speak right away. That silence told me more than any confession ever could. Then my daughter reached into her bag. She pulled out a manila folder. My heart didn't race. It sank. Heavy. Certain. "I brought some documents," she said gently, placing the folder on the bedside table without opening it. "Like a gift. Like an offering." "What kind of documents?" I asked. "Oh, nothing urgent," she replied. "Just things we should review together. While you're alert." Alert. As if that window might close at any moment. I didn't touch the folder. Didn't even look at it. I kept my eyes on her face, on the slight tension around her mouth, on the way my son watched my hands instead of my eyes. "You could have waited," I said. She smiled. "We thought it might bring peace of mind." That was the red flag. Not the folder. Not the timing. Peace of mind is what people offer when they're trying to take something. I picked up the folder then. It was thicker than it needed to be. Overprepared. Inside were copies of my mortgage statement, a beneficiary summary from one of my older accounts, and a draft will. A draft I didn't recognize. "This isn't current," I said quietly. My daughter tilted her head. "It's close. Close." Another word doing too much work. "I don't remember authorizing this." I added. My son stepped forward. "You talked about making changes last year." Talked. Not signed. Not filed. Not executed. "I talked," I said. "I didn't decide." The air shifted. Subtle. Like a door closing somewhere behind them. "We were just trying to help," my daughter said, but her voice had lost its softness. That's when I saw it clearly. They weren't confused. They were early. The folder wasn't preparation, it was anticipation. They had already begun the process, assuming the ending, assuming compliance, assuming silence. I closed the folder and handed it back. "Take this with you," I said. "We won't be reviewing anything today." My daughter hesitated before taking it, just a beat too long. "Well," she said, standing, "rest is important." Yes, rest. So I wouldn't notice what they were rushing. After they left, I asked the nurse to note in my chart that no medical information was to be shared without my direct consent. Then I asked for the hospital's patient advocate. That was my second mistake, because when the advocate arrived, she confirmed something I hadn't yet considered. My daughter hadn't just called once. She'd called 3 times. And each time, she'd asked the same question, just phrased differently. What happens if she doesn't make it? That was the moment the red flag stopped waving. It planted itself. And I understood. This wasn't concern pretending to be preparation. It was preparation pretending to be concern. They weren't waiting anymore. They were moving. And now, so was I. Once you've lived long enough, you stop believing in isolated incidents. You start seeing shapes. That afternoon, after the room settled back into its quiet hum, I replayed the last 48 hours the way I used to replay conversations with bill collectors, slowly, without mercy, listening for what was really being said. The timing wasn't random. The questions weren't spontaneous. And the concern, it was too evenly distributed to be real. I asked for my phone. Not to call anyone, just to look. My daughter had texted 3 times before I was admitted. Messages I brushed off then, short, oddly formal. Just checking in. Call me when you get a chance. Important. No warmth. No specifics. Just pressure wrapped in politeness. Then nothing. Until the hospital. That gap mattered. People who are worried don't go silent. People who are waiting do. I scrolled further back. Last month. The month before. Small things surfaced now that I wasn't rushing past them anymore. My son asking, casually, whether the house was still in my name. My daughter suggesting I simplify my accounts. My grandson joking about how I was set for life, like life had already reached its conclusion. At the time, I'd laughed. Mothers are trained to soften discomfort, to excuse what doesn't feel right, to call it curiosity instead of calculation. But patterns don't need emotion to be true. They only need repetition. The nurse came in to check my 4. I watched her hands, steady and sure. Do families usually push this hard? I asked. She didn't answer right away. Sometimes, she said finally, when there's uncertainty. Uncertainty for who? I wondered. After she left, I stared at the ceiling again. This time, I wasn't counting cracks. I was counting moves. They'd started with access, medical information, then orientation, documents, accounts, structure. Next would come authority. Power of attorney wasn't a suggestion. It was a step. And steps only matter when you're heading somewhere specific. That's when I remembered the voicemail. It had come in late last night, while I was asleep. Unknown number. I dismissed it earlier. My head foggy, my body tired. Now, I listened again. Just wanted to make sure everything's still on track, a man's voice said. Professional. Neutral. We're ready to proceed once you have confirmation. No name. No details. But I knew exactly what it was. Someone had been contacted. Not after I was admitted, before. I felt the ache then. Not sharp, not dramatic. Just deep. The kind that comes when betrayal settles into its final shape. I thought of all the quiet sacrifices I'd made. The hours. The patience. The forgiveness. And how none of that showed up on paper. I pressed the call button again. When the patient advocate returned, I asked her to help me request a full access log, medical, administrative, everything. Who'd called? Who'd asked? Who'd been told no? She nodded, already typing. You're within your rights, she said. I smiled at that, not because it was comforting, but because it was confirmation. Rights only matter when someone is trying to bypass them. Later that evening, my daughter returned alone. No cardigan this time. No coffee. Just urgency wrapped in a tired smile. I heard you spoke to an advocate, she said lightly, too lightly. I did, I replied. Her eyes flicked to the door. Then back to me. We're just trying to stay ahead of things, she said. Ahead of what? I didn't ask. I didn't challenge. I just watched her face as I said, I've decided to review everything myself once I'm discharged. Her mouth opened, then closed. That might take time, she said carefully. Yes, I agreed. It will. She nodded, stood, and kissed my cheek. Her lips were cold. As she left, I realized something important. They weren't afraid of me dying. They were afraid of me recovering, and whatever they had already set in motion, it was far enough along that stopping now would cost them something. That was the pattern, and patterns, once recognized, can be used. Humiliation doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it wears a smile and calls itself help. The morning of my discharge planning meeting, they showed up together again. Coordinated, efficient. My daughter carried a notebook this time. My son had printed forms. My grandson trailed behind them, earbuds dangling, eyes already bored. Like I was an errand. The social worker introduced herself, cheerful and brisk. She explained options: home care, temporary rehab, follow-up appointments. Normal things. Necessary things. My daughter interrupted before the woman could finish. "We've already discussed assisted living," she said. "Short term, of course." I turned my head slowly. "We have." "Well," she corrected, "we assumed." Assumed. The word landed hard. The social worker glanced at me. "Is that something you want to consider?" Before I could answer, my son stepped in. "Mom's been struggling," he said, like it was a fact already established. "Memory lapses. Confusion." Confusion. I felt my face warm, not from shame, but from anger held too long. The kind that tightens your jaw before you even realize it's there. "I manage my own finances," I said calmly. "I drove myself to appointments until last week. I live alone by choice." My daughter sighed, long and theatrical. "This is what we're worried about," she said to the social worker. She gets defensive. Defensive. That was the humiliation, not the suggestion, not even the lie.it was the public framing. They weren't questioning my health. They were redefining my credibility. The social worker nodded slowly, making notes. I watched the pen move across the page and felt something inside me go still. This wasn't about care. This was about record. I leaned forward slightly. "May I speak?" Everyone turned, surprised, like they'd forgotten I was still the subject, not the obstacle. "I am hospitalized due to a medical complication," I said evenly, "not cognitive decline. Any claims otherwise are inaccurate." My daughter smiled tight. "No one's accusing you of anything." Accusing. Another word doing too much work. The meeting ended awkwardly after that. The social worker said she'd follow up privately. My family left first, whispering just outside the door. They didn't bother lowering their voices enough. "She's being difficult. This would be easier if she'd just cooperate. We're running out of time." Time for what? When they were gone, the social worker returned alone. Her voice was gentler now. "I want to be clear," she said. "You are not being discharged to assisted living unless you request it." I nodded. "I know." "But," she added carefully, "your family has expressed concern about your decision-making capacity." There it was. The escalation. Concern isn't neutral when it's documented. After she left, I sat in the quiet and let the moment settle. Not the embarrassment. I'd survived worse. It was the disrespect that lingered. The ease with which they'd tried to lower me. The confidence. The assumption that I wouldn't push back. They'd moved from waiting to rewriting. That night, my daughter texted me. "We're just trying to protect you. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder for who? I didn't reply. Instead, I asked the nurse for a copy of my chart notes. All of them, including the discharge planning summary. When I read the words "family reports concerns regarding cognition," something in me locked into place. They had crossed a line, not emotionally, procedurally, and lines like that don't get uncrossed by conversations or forgiveness. They get addressed with documentation, timing, and precision. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back in the envelope. They thought humiliation would make me compliant. What it actually did was remove my last hesitation. Because when people are willing to diminish you publicly, they are already prepared to erase you privately. And now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. That night, I lay awake, listening to the hospital hum. Machines, footsteps, distant voices. Each one a reminder that life continued outside my room, outside their assumptions. But inside, I had something they didn't. Clarity. I had spent years teaching my children lessons they claimed to understand. About responsibility, patience, and integrity. About respect earned, not given. Yet here they were, playing a game, They thought I wouldn't notice, mistaking my kindness for weakness. I reached for the small notebook I'd kept hidden in my bedside drawer. It wasn't fancy, just lined paper and a worn cover, but inside were details, precise and deliberate. Account numbers, important dates, insurance contacts, passwords, property deeds. Everything they assumed I'd forgotten. Everything they assumed would be easy to manipulate. I turned the pages slowly, relishing the rhythm of the pen, the weight of truth. Every note was a silent message. I see you. I remember everything. I remembered the hospital call, the one I had dismissed as bureaucratic nonsense. Someone outside my family had already checked in on my status. They'd been ready to move once I faltered. That meant they had allies, not inside the family, outside, people with access, authority, people who thought the vulnerable would never notice. And yet, here I was, fully aware, fully alive, fully capable. I recalled my daughter's notebook, the draft will she had slipped onto my bedside table. I remembered the words she and my son had used, assumed, concern, responsible cooperation, each carefully chosen to suggest inevitability. Their language wasn't innocent, it was strategic, predictable, patterned. I realized something crucial. They didn't just want control over my property. They wanted control over my reality. To bend it so my voice, my decisions, my authority all seemed optional, invisible. I closed my notebook and leaned back, letting the bed support me fully. It wasn't fear that filled me, nor anger, though both were present. It was calculation, precision, a plan forming in the quiet spaces they assumed were empty. By morning, I decided I would test the waters, not with confrontation, too obvious, but with subtle observation. Every word, every gesture, every helpful suggestion would be noted, cross-checked, documented. And then, when the time was right, I would act. Legally, morally, irreproachably. Every step traced, every motive revealed, every lie exposed. They had assumed I was weak, that I would acquiesce under pressure, under embarrassment, under the guise of familial care. They were wrong. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the rhythm of my own heartbeat, steady, unyielding. I remembered the pride of raising a household alone, of paying every bill, of holding my family together when no one else would. That pride was not gone. It had only been tested, and tests have consequences. When I opened my eyes, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The private truth, the one they had no access to, was my weapon, my knowledge, my vigilance. I smiled faintly to myself. Let them plan. Let them strategize. Let them whisper about what they thought they were entitled to, because I was still here, because I was still watching. And the moment I chose, their carefully laid plans would crumble under the weight of evidence. Quietly, decisively, without warning. The first move, I decided, would be small, almost imperceptible. A test, a breadcrumb. And if they fell for it, well, then everything would fall into place. This was no longer just about survival. It was about justice. And justice, I reminded myself, is always personal. I didn't have to set the trap. They walked into it themselves. The day after my discharge papers were finalized, but before the discharge itself, my son arrived alone. No notebook, no forms, just his phone and a confidence that hadn't earned its place yet. That was my first signal. People don't come unarmed unless they believe the work is already done. He sat without asking, crossed his legs, and sighed like a man burdened by responsibility he never volunteered for. You know, he began, this whole situation has everyone worried. Everyone. Another collective meant to blur accountability. I can imagine, I said. He nodded, encouraged. We just don't want things to get complicated later. Later again. Always later. A future they spoke about as if it were already theirs. I was actually meaning to ask you something, he continued, glancing at the door before lowering his voice. Hypothetically. Hypothetically is what people say when they want the answer to count. If something had happened, he said, would everything have gone through probate, or was it already structured? There it was. Not concern. Not care. Process. I looked at him for a long moment, letting the silence do what I didn't need to rush. What makes you ask that? I said. He shrugged, too casually, just trying to understand timelines. Timelines. As if my life were a project plan. Well, I said slowly, that would depend on what version of my estate documents you're referring to. His eyes sharpened. Just a fraction. What do you mean? I said, there are multiple drafts. Only one of them is valid. He leaned forward then. And which one is that? The slip wasn't in the question. It was in the assumption that he was entitled to the answer. That information isn't shared verbally, I said. It's executed. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course. I just meant if we needed to step in quickly. Step in. You wouldn't, I replied. Not legally. That's when he said it. Well, the attorney said. He stopped himself mid-sentence. Too late. I kept my face neutral, my voice even. Which attorney? He blinked. Recovered too fast. I meant if we ever consulted one. Consulted. Backpedaling. But the damage was done. Because now I knew. They hadn't just drafted documents. They had spoken to someone. Someone official enough to talk about probate. Someone who believed the conversation was appropriate. Someone who assumed I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, or wouldn't be for long. I nodded slowly, like this was new information, like it hadn't just confirmed everything I'd suspected. Well, I said, it's good you're thinking ahead. He relaxed instantly, mistaking my calm for surrender. Exactly, he said. We're just trying to avoid confusion. Confusion again. That word was doing a lot of work for them. After he left, I didn't move for a long time. Then I reached for my phone. I didn't call family. I didn't call friends. I called my attorney, the one I'd retained years ago, quietly after watching a friend lose control of her estate to children who swore they were only helping. When she answered, I said one sentence. I need to know who contacted your office pretending to represent my interests. There was a pause, then a breath. I was hoping you'd call, she said. That was the moment the floor shifted. She told me everything. Dates, names, questions asked, assumptions made. Not instructions, but fishing. Careful, strategic fishing. No laws broken. Yet, but intent was clear. They had positioned themselves as inevitabilities. Executors in waiting. Voices of reason preparing for a woman who wouldn't be around to object. They hadn't forged anything. They'd simply spoken too soon. And that was the slip. I ended the call, steadied my hands, and stared out the window. They thought the danger was death. They didn't realize the real threat was my survival with awareness. Because now I had confirmation, names, timelines, and a record that proved this wasn't concern after a crisis. It was preparation before consent. From that moment on, this stopped being emotional. It became procedural, and procedures, when followed correctly, leave very little room for escape. The warning didn't come from my family. It came from the paperwork. 2 days after I returned home, a certified envelope was waiting on my kitchen table. I recognized the return address before I touched it. County Records Office. Not dramatic, not urgent looking, just official enough to matter. I sat down before opening it. Age teaches you when to lower your body before the truth lowers you itself. Inside was a notice of inquiry, routine language, polite phrasing. Someone had requested confirmation of ownership status related to my property in anticipation of a potential estate transition. Anticipation. Not death. Not incapacity. Anticipation. I laughed then. Once. Short and sharp. Because this was no longer speculation. This was movement. They hadn't forged. They hadn't stolen. They had done something smarter and more dangerous. They had positioned themselves early, quietly, so that when the moment came, the system would already recognize their presence. That's how grown people steal, without ever touching what isn't theirs. I called the number listed. The clerk was efficient, neutral. She explained that inquiries like this happen often. Family members wanting to understand next steps. No action taken. No changes made. But the inquiry is logged, she added. Logged. I thanked her and hung up, my hand steady now, because this was the warning I needed. They were no longer reacting to my illness. They were preparing for my absence. That afternoon, my daughter came by unannounced. No bags. No flowers. Just purpose. She stood in the doorway like a woman entering a negotiation she expected to win. I heard you made some calls, she said. I raised an eyebrow. Did you? Her mouth tightened. You're making people nervous. People. Always people. I'm allowed to. I said, it's my life. She stepped inside without being invited, looking around my living room like it was already hers. The couch I paid for. The rug I saved for. The photos I framed myself. You don't need to complicate things, she said. This could all be handled smoothly. Smoothly. The language of erasure. I've already handled things. I replied. She froze. Just for a second. What things? The ones that don't require your involvement. That was the warning I gave her. Not loud. Not threatening. Just precise. She tried to recover. We're just worried you're being influenced. Influenced. The final move. By who? I asked. She didn't answer, because she couldn't name anyone without revealing too much. I walked past her and opened my desk drawer, pulling out a folder, not the real one, not the important one, just enough paper to look convincing. I've updated everything, I said calmly, and I've added protections. Her breath caught. I heard it. Protections from what? She asked. From confusion, I said, using their word. She stared at the folder like it might bite her. You should have told us, she said finally. No, I replied. You should have waited. The silence between us stretched. Heavy. Informative. She left without another word. That evening, I made 3 calls. One to my attorney to initiate a formal notice of boundaries. One to my financial institution to add an alert requiring in-person verification for any inquiry. And one to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Not family, an ally. As I hung up the phone, I understood something important. Warnings aren't always meant to stop behavior. Sometimes they're meant to mark the moment when everyone knows the game has changed. They knew now, and knowing doesn't make people back down. It makes them desperate, which meant the next move wouldn't be careful. It would be fast, and it would leave a record. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening to the house settle around me. Whatever they tried next, they would reveal more than they intended, because people who believe time is running out make mistakes. The ally didn't arrive with comfort. She arrived with questions. Her name was Denise, and she used to work 3 desks down from me back when I still had a badge and a pension plan. We weren't close in the way people confuse with loyalty. We were close in the way women get when they've seen systems from the inside and survived without pretending otherwise. She came over the next afternoon with a legal pad and no sympathy in her eyes. That Wasn't a casual inquiry, she said after I showed her the notice from the county. That was positioning. I know, I replied. She nodded once. No drama. No pity. Just recognition. Denise had spent 20 years in municipal administration before retiring early. Records, filings, access requests. She knew how people test doors before they try to walk through them. Tell me everything, she said. So I did. Not emotionally. Chronologically. Dates. Language used. Who asked what and when. I told her about the hospital, the discharge meeting, the assisted living suggestion, the attorney's slip. She wrote quietly, stopping only to ask for clarification. When I finished, she leaned back and exhaled through her nose. They're building a narrative, she said. Not for you. For the system. That's what I thought. They don't need you to agree, she continued. They need you to look unreliable long enough for others to step in on your behalf. Behalf. Another word that gets misused when power is involved. So what do? I asked. She looked at me like the question itself was unnecessary. You document faster than they move, she said. And you stop being reactive. She opened her bag and pulled out a slim folder. Inside were checklists, not templates, not generic advice. Real steps, dates, offices, paper trails. This is how people protect themselves without accusing anyone, she said. You don't confront. You clarify. Publicly. Formally. She walked me through it. A capacity assessment, voluntary, recent, and independent. A notarized statement of intent regarding my residence. A written reaffirmation of existing estate documents, logged and time-stamped. A list of authorized contacts, short, specific, unambiguous. Each step was boring. That's how I knew it would work. Drama alerts people. Documentation anchors reality. What about family? I asked. She didn't hesitate. You treat them like any other interested party. With boundaries. That word felt heavier than warning ever had. We spent the next 2 hours making calls, scheduling appointments, requesting confirmations. Nothing urgent, nothing emotional, just quiet, methodical reinforcement of facts. At one point, she stopped and looked at me. They've already overreached, she said. They just don't know it yet. How so? Because they assumed you'd stay silent out of love. And now you're acting out of clarity. That night, after Denise left, my phone buzzed. A text from my son. We need to talk. Urgently. Urgency again. The language of people losing control. I didn't respond. Instead, I reviewed the confirmations that had already come in by email. Dates. Names. Case numbers. Neutral acknowledgments that something existed and that I was the one requesting it. I slept well that night, the kind of sleep you get when your footing is solid again. The next morning, my daughter called, not to check on me, to ask if I changed anything. No, I said truthfully. I clarified. There was a pause on the line, longer than usual. That wasn't necessary, she said. It was, I replied. And it's done. She hung up without saying goodbye. By afternoon, the first assessment appointment was confirmed. By evening, my financial alerts were active. And by nightfall, I had something more valuable than proof. I had an ally who understood that power doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly. And once it does, it doesn't need to argue. It just stands. The day it arrived, I was folding laundry in my sunlit living room. Ordinary, calm, routine. Everything they expected me to be. The envelope was thick, professional, and entirely unassuming. No flashy logos, no red flags. Just my attorney's return address and my name in clean block letters. I set the laundry aside and slid it open. Inside was a single folder. I pulled out the documents carefully as if they were fragile artifacts. And, in a sense, they were. It was a notarized, fully updated affirmation of my estate and financial accounts. Every prior draft, every attempted update by my family, every unauthorized inquiry was addressed in black and white. My property, my finances, my authority, all explicitly reaffirmed under law. But the most important page was at the front, a declaration of intent, written in clear, uncompromising language, signed, witnessed, and notarized. Every asset I owned, every account, every property, every decision about care or access, my voice alone controlled it. I reread it slowly, my name repeated, my authority emphasized, every potential loophole closed, every assumption they had relied on invalidated. This was the document that changed everything. I leaned back in my chair and let the sun warm my face. I had proof. I had authority. I had clarity. And for the first time since my hospitalization, I felt the subtle surge of power that comes from knowing you are untouchable within your own rights. Later that afternoon, my daughter stopped by. She hadn't called first. She hadn't announced herself. She just appeared, assuming the usual entrance, confident, soft smile, and carefully rehearsed concern. I let her settle on the couch before I spoke. Calm. Controlled. Did you receive this? I asked, holding up the folder like it was a shield. Her smile faltered. Her eyes flicked to the papers. Yes, she said cautiously. I haven't had a chance to look yet. I set it down on the coffee table. Everything is in order. My intentions are clear. Legally binding. Nothing can be altered without my knowledge. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She had no words that could undo what was written. That's when I realized just how dangerous clarity can be. People who assume inevitability will act recklessly. People who assume compliance will step too far. And once that line is crossed, it's impossible to erase. Do you understand? I asked. Quiet, not threatening, just stating facts. Yes, she whispered. Her eyes avoided mine. The mask of concern had slipped. For the first time, I saw impatience, frustration, maybe even fear. That's when I knew the narrative they had tried to control, the version of reality where I was weak or confused or unaware, it had ended. And I had not just survived, I had secured my position. Later, my son called, not to discuss care, not to check in, to ask a single question. Did you really do all that? Yes, I said, and it's effective immediately. He paused, swallowed, and hung up without another word. That night, I placed the folder in a safe. My control was no longer theoretical. It was tangible, procedural, and it could not be contested without my consent. I realized something then, something that felt like a quiet triumph. They had moved first. I had waited. I had let them reveal themselves. Let them make their slips. Let them assume power that wasn't theirs. And now, with a single document, every assumption they had relied on was null. From here, every move I made would be deliberate, calculated, and fully documented. The game had shifted, and I was no longer playing defense. The trap didn't snap shut all at once. It tightened, quietly, patiently, the way things do when you stop rushing and start letting people hang themselves with their own assumptions. 3 days after the documents were finalized, I received a call from my bank's fraud and compliance department. Not alarmed, not apologetic, just procedural. They wanted to confirm whether I had authorized a third-party inquiry regarding my investment account. I had not. The woman on the line cleared her throat. We didn't proceed, she said. Your new verification flags worked exactly as intended. Exactly as intended. She explained that the caller had identified herself as my daughter, citing concern about my health and possible incapacity. She'd asked about transfer timelines and beneficiary confirmation. Not access. Timelines. The same word again. Consistent. Predictable. I thanked the woman and asked for a written summary of the interaction. She said it would be emailed within the hour. That email became the first tooth in the trap. The next call came from the county clerk's office. Another inquiry, this time regarding whether a durable power of attorney had been recorded recently. Again, my daughter's name. Again, no action taken. Again, logged. By the end of the week, I had a clean, chronological trail. Not accusations. Not emotions. Just documented attempts to move ahead of consent. That's when I did the only thing left to do. I stopped shielding them. I scheduled a family meeting. Not at my house. Neutral ground. A conference room at my attorney's office. Glass table. Neutral walls. No comfort. No familiarity. They arrived together. Of course they did. My daughter was tight-lipped, arms folded. My son avoided eye contact. My grandson sat silent, phone face down for once. No one smiled. My attorney opened the meeting with facts, not commentary. She reviewed the reaffirmed estate documents, the capacity assessment, the access logs, the unauthorized inquiries, each one presented calmly, without accusation. I watched their faces change as the pattern became undeniable. My daughter spoke first. We were just trying to be prepared. My attorney nodded. Preparation without authorization is still action. Silence followed. Heavy. Exposing. My son finally looked at me. Why didn't you just tell us what you were doing? I met his eyes. Because you didn't ask. You assumed. That landed harder than any raised voice ever could. My attorney slid one final document across the table. A formal notice. Not punitive. Protective. From this point forward, any further attempts to access my financial, medical, or legal information without written consent would be documented and escalated as potential coercive interference. No threats, just consequences. My daughter's hands trembled as she read. This makes us look bad, she said. No, I replied. Your actions did that. That was the moment the trap fully closed. Because now the narrative was fixed. Not concerned children caring for an aging parent, but adults attempting to preemptively control assets without authority. If they pushed further, it would no longer be private. It would be public record. They left without arguing, without apologies, without resolution. That told me everything. In the weeks that followed, the attempt stopped. No more calls. No more just checking in. No more urgency. Distance replaced pressure. And with it came something unexpected. Relief. Not because I had won, but because I had removed myself from the need to be understood by people who were never listening. One afternoon, Denise came by again. She reviewed the final confirmations, nodded once, and closed her folder. They can't move now, she said. Any step forward costs them more than it gains. I smiled. Not wide, not triumphant. Measured. Because the revenge wasn't loud. It didn't humiliate. It didn't destroy. It simply exposed, contained, and ended the behavior using nothing but the truth and the system they thought they could outsmart. That night, I sat alone in my living room, the same one my daughter had once walked through like it was already hers. Everything was quiet. Everything was still mine. And for the first time since the hospital, I wasn't watching for the next move. There wasn't one left for them to make. Public exposure doesn't always mean headlines. Sometimes it means minutes, official ones. The notice came from my attorney first, a courtesy call. The county had finalized the access log review. Routine, they said. No accusations. No penalties. Just a formal clarification entered into record. All prior inquiries made by third parties had been unauthorized and resolved with no action taken. That clarification mattered more than anything dramatic ever could. Because once something is clarified publicly, it stops being a family disagreement and becomes a matter of record. A week later, I received an invitation I hadn't expected. The Community Housing Board, where my name had quietly appeared months earlier on a future interest inquiry, was holding its quarterly meeting. My attorney suggested I attend. Not to speak, she said, just to be present. Presence is a powerful thing when people assume your absence. I dressed carefully that morning. Not formal, not frail, just myself, the woman who had chaired committees, balanced budgets, and raised children without applause. When I entered the room, conversation dipped. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. The board chair smiled, surprised. We didn't expect you today. I'm aware, I replied. I took a seat near the back, listened, watched. Midway through the meeting, my name came up. Not an alarm, just in passing. A clarification item. The chair cleared her throat. We'd like to note for the record that Ms. Graham has confirmed she is not pursuing assisted living placement at this time. Any prior inquiries were made without her authorization. No emphasis, no judgment, but every eye in the room turned toward me. I nodded once. That was it. No defense required. After the meeting, 2 women approached me. Polite, curious. We were told you weren't well. One said gently, I replied, I am. That distinction hung in the air. Word travels faster in professional circles than gossip ever does. By the end of the week, I received 3 confirmations from offices I hadn't contacted, acknowledging updated records, corrected assumptions, and my direct authority. No one apologized. They didn't need to. The exposure wasn't about shame. It was about correction. At church that Sunday, my daughter avoided my row. My son sat stiffly, eyes forward. The pastor spoke about honoring elders, not loudly, not pointedly, but I felt the words settle where they needed to. After service, a woman from the congregation squeezed my hand. It's good to see you back, she said. We were worried. So was I replied. That afternoon, my phone rang. My grandson. Grandma, he said quietly, I didn't know everything. I know, I told him. And I meant it. Public exposure doesn't always burn bridges. Sometimes it reveals who was standing where when the light came on. By the time the final confirmation arrived, a letter stating that any future inquiries regarding my affairs would require my in-person consent, I felt no triumph, only closure, because the story had corrected itself. The version where I was fragile, confused, fading, that version no longer had an audience. And the people who had relied on that version were left standing with nothing but their own reflection. That night, I sat on my porch and watched the neighborhood settle into itself. Lights flickering on, doors closing, life continuing. They hadn't lost anything they were entitled to. They had only lost access to something that was never theirs. And that distinction, quiet, public, irreversible, was enough. The collapse wouldn't be loud, but it had already begun. The collapse didn't come with shouting or apologies. It came with absence. No calls. No checking in. No sudden concern dressed up as politeness. The noise they'd relied on, the pressure, the urgency, the constant hovering, fell away all at once, like scaffolding pulled from a building that was never finished. At first, I noticed it in small ways. My daughter stopped forwarding articles about elder care. My son stopped texting reminders about appointments I already had under control. Family group messages went quiet, except for birthdays and obligatory holidays, the kind that require nothing but a thumbs up. Silence can be a form of surrender, but it wasn't just emotional distance. The real collapse happened on paper. My attorney called me one afternoon, her tone almost casual. "They've withdrawn," she said. "From what?" I asked, though I already knew. "Everything," she replied. "All informal inquiries. All third-party contacts. No more positioning." Positioning. The word again, but now it sounded hollow. She explained that once the public clarifications were logged and the protective notices issued, continuing would have required escalation. Formal claims, sworn statements, legal exposure. They hadn't wanted that. They wanted inevitability without fingerprints. And now that inevitability had been replaced with oversight, the system had done what systems do best when properly engaged. It forced people to choose between truth and risk. They chose retreat. A week later, I received a letter from the assisted living community. Polite, brief, acknowledging the correction of records and confirming removal of my name from all future interest lists. No drama, no embarrassment, just reversal. I filed it away with the others. That same evening, my daughter showed up at my door for the first time in weeks. She didn't come in right away. She stood on the porch like someone unsure of the rules. "You look well," she said. "I am," I replied. She nodded, eyes drifting past me into the house. The house she once walked through with ownership in her posture. "I didn't realize things had gone that far," she said. "I waited. That wasn't my intention," she added. "Intentions are easy to claim when outcomes fail. What was your intention?" I asked. She hesitated, and in that hesitation was the truth she didn't say. "I thought I was helping," she finally replied. "No," I said gently. "You were preparing." She flinched, not visibly, but internally. I could tell. Mothers know when they've landed a truth their children weren't ready to hear. "I was scared," she said. "So was I," I answered. "The difference is I didn't try to erase you because of it." She didn't argue. That's how I knew it was over. The collapse wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about revenge in the way people imagine it, loud, destructive, humiliating. It was about removal. I had removed the version of reality they were relying on, removed their access, removed their urgency, removed the assumption that time was on their side. Without those things, their plan had nothing to stand on. After she left, I sat alone in my living room and felt something unexpected. Not victory, relief. Because carrying awareness is heavy work. Watching people you love turn procedural is exhausting. Surviving that without becoming bitter takes effort. The collapse meant I no longer had to watch. The threat wasn't looming anymore. It had exhausted itself against structure. In the days that followed, life returned to its quieter rhythms. Appointments kept, bills paid, mornings slow and deliberate. I wasn't rebuilding, I was resuming. And in that normalcy was the deepest confirmation of all. They hadn't just failed to take control. They had lost the right to pretend they ever should have had it. The collapse didn't break them. It revealed them. And once revealed, they had nowhere left to stand. The aftermath wasn't dramatic. It was orderly. That's what surprised me most. How clean everything felt once the tension drained out of my days. No more bracing myself when the phone rang. No more reading between lines. No more wondering what was being said about me in rooms I wasn't in. Life resumed its proper shape. I woke up when I wanted. I drank my coffee slow. I folded laundry without interruption and paid bills without commentary. Ordinary acts regained their dignity once no one was watching them for leverage. That's how I knew the danger had passed. People who are plotting don't disappear quietly. They hover. They test. They re-enter sideways. My family didn't. They adjusted. My son started sending neutral messages, weather updates, photos of the dog, nothing that required response. My daughter limited contact to holidays and group texts. Polite, contained, boundaried, exactly how adults behave when they've been corrected by a system they can't argue with. At church, the looks shifted too. Not curiosity, recognition. The quiet kind. The kind that says we see you standing where you belong. No one asked questions. No one needed explanations. That mattered more than sympathy ever could. One afternoon, I sat with Denise on my porch, watching the neighborhood move through its routines. She didn't bring her folder this time. No notes. No checklists. You're clear now, she said, more statement than question. I am, I replied. She nodded. They won't try again. I know. What made the difference, she said, is that you never begged to be believed. She was right. I hadn't pleaded. I hadn't cried. I hadn't defended myself emotionally. I had simply stood in the record. That's what changed everything. The capacity assessment came back clean and thorough. The reaffirmed documents were fully logged. The alerts remained in place, quiet and invisible, like locked doors no one thought to rattle anymore. The system now recognized me as the sole authority it had always been, but only once I insisted on being seen. That's the part no one tells older women. You don't lose power because of age. You lose it because you stop asserting it procedurally. One evening, my grandson came by alone. He looked uncomfortable, hands in his pockets, eyes searching the room like it might judge him. I didn't know they were doing all that, he said. I believe you, I told him. He swallowed. I should have asked. Yes, I agreed. You should have. But I didn't punish him with silence. I poured him tea, asked about his work, let him stay, because aftermath isn't about hardening. It's about deciding who still has access to your softness and under what conditions. As for my daughter and son, I didn't cut them off. I didn't need to. Distance found its own balance once control was no longer on the table. We spoke less, but when we did, the conversations stayed where they belonged, in the present. No future planning, no hypothetical endings, no timelines. Just now. That was the price of their earlier certainty, and it was fair. Late one night, I opened the safe and looked at the folder again, not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted to remember how easily things could have gone differently if I'd stayed quiet. I thought about how many women never notice until it's too late, how many families dress control up as care, how often silence is mistaken for consent. I locked the safe and turned off the light. The aftermath wasn't loneliness. It was peace earned through clarity. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had simply removed myself from their plans. And in doing so, I reclaimed something far more valuable than property or accounts. I reclaimed authorship. The ending was no longer being drafted around me. It was mine again, and I intended to finish it on my own terms. The quiet came back slowly, not the silence of fear or distance, but the kind that settles when nothing is reaching for you anymore. I noticed it one morning while watering the plants on my windowsill. No interruptions. No phone buzzing with urgency disguised as concern. No one monitoring my tone, my energy, my supposed limits. Just me, breathing, standing, deciding what came next. That's what quiet power feels like. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need witnesses. It simply exists because it's protected. Months passed. Seasons shifted. My health stabilized fully, not in a miraculous way, just the ordinary way bodies do when they're allowed time and care. Follow-ups came back clean. The system remained still around me, which is exactly how a system behaves when there's nothing left to contest. My children adjusted into their new roles, not caretakers, not planners, not heirs in waiting, just adults. We spoke when there was something real to say. We shared meals occasionally. We disagreed without maneuvering. No one mentioned estates. No one spoke in timelines. That alone told me the lesson had landed. One afternoon, I sat at my desk and wrote a letter not to them, but to myself. Not legal, not official, just truth. I wrote about the moment in the hospital when I realized love had been replaced by calculation, about how painful that recognition was and how necessary. I wrote about how restraint saved me, how waiting let them reveal themselves without me accusing a single soul. I folded the letter and placed it in the safe behind the documents that had done the real work, because paperwork ends conflict, but memory preserves wisdom. I've learned that revenge doesn't have to shout. It doesn't need to destroy relationships or burn bridges or humiliate anyone publicly. Sometimes revenge is simply refusing to be erased. Sometimes it's insisting calmly, procedurally, irreversibly that your voice carries weight until your last day and beyond. They thought my age made me invisible. They were wrong. Age sharpened me. It taught me timing. It taught me restraint. It taught me that the most powerful move is often the one that lets others underestimate you until they can't move at all. I still live in the same house. I sit on the same porch. I drink my coffee the same way. But something fundamental has changed. I no longer confuse proximity with loyalty. I no longer trade clarity for peace. I no longer soften truths to protect people who would not protect me. That is the inheritance I kept for myself. Everything else is just paperwork. If you're reading this and something in you feels familiar, if you've ever sensed that quiet shift, that moment when concern started sounding like control, pay attention to it. You don't need to confront. You don't need to accuse. You don't need to rush. You just need to document, clarify, and stand. Quiet power lasts longer than anger ever could, and it leaves you with what matters most in the end. Your name, your choices, your life authored by you. If this story spoke to you, leave a comment, and where you are from, share to friends, and follow the Vintage Vengeance channel. Stay close. Sometimes the most important lessons aren't taught loudly. They're passed hand to hand, woman to woman, in moments like this.